Almost. 13. In bed again. "She won't see you," Allie said. She sounded frightened. "She doesn't see anybody. She only comes out on Sunday evenings to scare the hell out of everybody."
"How long has she been here?"
12 years, or maybe only 2. Time's funny, as thou knows. Let's not talk about her."
"Where did she come from? Which direction?"
"I don't know."
"Lying. Allie?"
"I don't know."
"Allie?"
All right. She came from the dwellers, from the desert."
"I thought so." He relaxed a little. Southeast, in other words. Along the path he followed. The one he could even see in the sky sometimes. And he guessed the preacher woman had come a lot further than from the dwellers or even the desert. How had she traveled so far? By way of some old machine that still worked? A train, mayhap? Where does she live?
Her voice dropped a notch. "If I tell you, will you make love to me?"
"I'll make love to you anyway, but I want to know."
Allie sighed. It was an old yellow sound, like turning pages. "She has a house over the knoll in back of the church, a little shack. It's where the real minister used to live until he moved out. Is that enough? Are you satisfied?"
"No, not yet." And he rolled on top of her. 14. It was the last day, and he knew it. The sky was an ugly, bruised purple, weirdly lit from above with the first fingers of dawn. Allie moved about like a wraith, lighting lamps, tending corn fritters that sputtered in the skillet. He had loved her hard after she had told him what he had to know, and she had sensed the coming end, and had given more than she had ever given. And she had given it with desperation against the coming of dawn, given it with the tireless energy of 16. But she was pale this morning, on the brink of menopause again. She served him without a word. He ate rapidly, chewing, swallowing, chasing each bite with hot coffee. Allie went to the bat wings and stood staring out at the morning, at the silent battalions of slow-moving clouds.
"It's going to dust up today."
"I'm not surprised."
"Are you ever?" she asked ironically, and turned to watch him get his hat. He clapped it on his head and brushed past her.
"Sometimes," he told her. He only saw her once more alive. 15. By the time he reached Sylvia Pittston's shack, the wind had died utterly, and the whole world seemed to wait. He had been in desert country long enough to know that the longer the lull, the harder the blow when it finally came. A queer, flat light hung over everything. There was a large wooden cross nailed to the door of the place, which was leaning and tired. He rapped and waited. No answer. He rapped again. No answer. He drew back and kicked in the door with one hard shot of his right boot. A small bolt on the inside ripped free. The door banged against a haphazardly planked wall and scared rats into skittering flight. Sylvia Pittston sat in the hall, in a mammoth ironwood rocker, and looked at him calmly with those great and dark eyes. The stormlight fell on her cheeks in crazy half-tones. She wore a shawl. The rocker made tiny squeaking noises. They looked at each other for a long, clockless moment. "You will never catch him," she said. "You walk in the way of evil." "He came to you," the gunslinger said, "and to my bed. He spoke to me in the tongue, the high speech. He screwed you, in every sense of the word." She did not flinch. "You walk an evil way, gunslinger. You stand in shadows,
You stood in the shadows of the holy place last night. Did you think I couldn't see you?
Why did he heal the weed-eater?
He's an angel of God. He said so.
I hope he smiled when he said it. She drew her lip back from her teeth in an unconsciously feral gesture.
He told me you would follow. He told me what to do. He said you are the Antichrist.
The gunslinger shook his head. He didn't say that. She smiled up at him lazily.
He said you would want to bed me. Is it true?
Did you ever meet a man who didn't want to bed you?
The price of my flesh would be your life, gunslinger. He has got me with child, not his, but the child of a great king. If you invade me...
She let the lazy smile complete her thought. At the same time she gestured with her huge, mountainous thighs. They stretched beneath her garment like pure marble slabs. The effect was dizzying. The gunslinger dropped his hands to the butts of his pistols. You have a demon, woman, not a king. Yet fear not. I can remove it. The effect was instantaneous. She recoiled against the chair, and a weasel look flashed on her face.
Don't touch me. Don't come near me. You dare not touch the bride of God.
Want to bet? The gunslinger said. He stepped toward her. As the gambler said when he laid down a handful of cups and wands, just watch me. The flesh on the huge frame quaked. Her face had become a caricature of terror, and she stabbed the sign of the eye at him with pronged fingers. The desert, the gunslinger said. What after the desert?
You'll never catch him. Never, never. You'll burn. He told me so.
I'll catch him, the gunslinger said. We both know it. What is beyond the desert?
No.
Answer me.
No.
He slid forward, dropped to his knees, and grabbed her thighs. Her legs locked like a vice. She made strange, lustful keening noises. The demon, then, he said. Out it comes.
No.
He pried the legs apart and unholstered one of his guns.
No, no, no.
Her breath came in short, savage grunts. Answer me. She rocked in the chair, and the floor trembled. Prayers and garbled bits of scripture flew from her lips. He rammed the barrel of the gun forward. He could feel the terrified wind sucked into her lungs more than he could hear it. Her hands beat at his head, her legs drummed against the floor, and at the same time the huge body tried to suck the invader in. Outside, nothing watched them but the bruised and dusty sky. She screamed something, high and inarticulate. What?
Mountains.
What about them?
He stops on the other side. Sweet Jesus! To make his strength meditation. Do you understand? Oh, I'm...
The whole huge mountain of flesh suddenly strained forward and upward, yet he was careful not to let her secret flesh touch him. Then she seemed to wilt and grow smaller, and she wept with her hands in her lap. So, he said, getting up, the demon is served, eh?
Get out. You've killed the child of the Crimson King. But you will be repaid. I set my watch and warrant on it. Now get out. Get out.
He stopped at the door and looked back. No child, he said briefly. No angel, prince, no demon.
Leave me alone.
He did. XVI. By the time he arrived at Kennerly's, a queer obscurity had come over the northern horizon, and he knew it was dust. Over Tull, the air was still dead quiet. Kennerly was waiting for him on the chaff-strewn stage that was the floor of his barn. "Leaving?" He grinned abjectly at the gunslinger. "Yeah. Not before the storm?" "Ahead of it.
The wind goes faster than any man on a mule. In the open, it can kill you. I want the mule now, the gunslinger said simply. Sure. But Kennerly did not turn away, merely stood as if searching for something further to say, grinning his groveling, hate-filled grin, and his eyes flicked up and over the gunslinger's shoulder. The gunslinger sidestepped and turned at the same time, and the heavy stick of stovewood that the girl Subi held swished through the air, grazing his elbow only. She lost hold of it with the force of her swing, and it clattered over the floor. In the explosive height of the loft, barn swallows took shadowed wing. The girl looked at him bovinely, her breasts thrust with overripe grandeur at the wash-faded shirt she wore. One thumb sought the haven of her mouth with dreamlike slowness. The gunslinger turned back to Kennerly. Kennerly's grin was huge. His skin was waxy yellow. His eyes rolled in their sockets. He began in a phlegm-filled whisper and could not continue. The mule, the gunslinger prodded gently. Sure, Kennerly whispered, the grin now touched with incredulity that he should still be alive. He shuffled to get it. The gunslinger moved to where he could watch the man go. The hostler brought the mule back and handed him the bridle. You get it and tend your sister, he said to Subi. Subi tossed her head and didn't move. The gunslinger left them there, staring at each other across the dusty, droppings-strewn floor, he with a sick grin, she with dumb, inanimate defiance. Outside, the heat was still like a hammer. 17. He walked the mule up the center of the street, his boots sending up squirts of dust. His water bags, swollen with water, were strapped across the mule's back. He stopped at the Tonk, but Allie was not there. The place was deserted, battened down for the storm, but still dirty from the night before. It stank of sour beer. He filled his tote sack with cornmeal, dried and roasted corn, and half of the raw hamburg in the cooler. He left 4 gold pieces stacked on the planked counter. Allie did not come down. Sheb's piano bid him a silent, yellow-toothed toodaloo. He stepped back out and cinched the tote sack across the mule's back. There was a tight feeling in his throat. He might still avoid the trap, but the chances were small. He was, after all, the interloper. He walked past the shuttered, waiting buildings, feeling the eyes that peered through cracks and chinks. The man in black had played God in Tull. He had spoken of a king's child, a red prince. Was it only a sense of the cosmic comic, or a matter of desperation? It was a question of some importance. There was a shrill, harried scream from behind him, and doors suddenly threw themselves open. Forms lunged. The trap was sprung. Men in long handles and men in dirty dungarees, women in slacks and in faded dresses, even children tagging after their parents, and in every hand there was a chunk of wood or a knife. His reaction was automatic, instantaneous, inbred. He whirled on his heels while his hands pulled the guns from their holsters, the butts heavy and sure in his hands. It was Allie. And of course it had to be Allie, coming at him with her face distorted, the scar a hellish purple in the lowering light. He saw that she was held hostage. The distorted, grimacing face of Sheb peered over her shoulder like a witch's familiar. She was his shield and sacrifice. He saw it all, clear and shadowless, in the frozen, deathless light of the sterile calm, and heard her. "Kill me, Roland, kill me. I said the word, 19, I said, and he told me, I can't bear it." The hands were trained to give her what she wanted. He was the last of his breed, and it was not only his mouth that knew the high speech. The guns beat their heavy, atonal music into the air. Her mouth flapped, and she sagged, and the guns fired again. The last expression on her face might have been gratitude. Sheb's head snapped back. They both fell into the dust. "They've gone to the land of 19, he thought. whatever is there. Sticks flew through the air, rained on him. He staggered, fended them off. One with a nail pounded raggedly through it, ripped at his arm and drew blood. A man with a beard stubble and sweat-stained armpits lunged, flying at him with a dull kitchen knife held in one paw. The gunslinger shot him dead, and the man thumped into the street. His false teeth shot out as his chin struck, and grinned, spit shiny in the dirt. "Satan!" someone was screaming. "The accursed! Bring him down!" "The interloper!" another voice cried. Sticks rained on him. A knife struck his boot and bounced. "The interloper! The Antichrist!" He blasted his way through the middle of them, running as the bodies fell, his hands picking the targets with ease and dreadful accuracy. 2 men and a woman went down, and he ran through the hole they left. He led them a feverish parade across the street and toward the rickety general store barber shop that faced Sheb's. He mounted the boardwalk, turned again, and fired the rest of his loads into the charging crowd. Behind them, Sheb and Allie and the others lay crucified in the dust. They never hesitated or faltered, although every shot he fired found a vital spot, and they had probably never seen a gun. He retreated, moving his body like a dancer to avoid the flying missiles. He reloaded as he went, with a rapidity that had also been trained into his fingers. They shuttled busily between gun belts and cylinders. The mob came up over the boardwalk, and he stepped into the general store and rammed the door closed. The large display window to the right shattered inward, and 3 men crowded through. Their faces were zealously blank, their eyes filled with bland fire. He shot them all, and the 2 that followed them. They fell in the window, hung on the jutting shards of glass, choking the opening. The door crashed and shuddered with their weight, and he could hear her voice. "The killer! Your souls! The cloven hoof!" The door ripped off its hinges and fell straight in, making a flat handclap. Dust puffed up from the floor. Men, women, and children charged him. Spittle and stovewood flew. He shot his guns empty, and they fell like 9 pins in a game of points. He retreated into the barber shop, shoving over a flour barrel, rolling it at them, throwing a pan of boiling water that contained 2 nicked straight-razors. They came on, screaming with frantic incoherency. From somewhere, Sylvia Pittston exhorted them, her voice rising and falling in blind inflections. He pushed shells into hot chambers, smelling the aromas of shave and tonsure, smelling his own flesh as the calluses at the tips of his fingers singed. He went through the back door and onto the porch. The flat scrubland was at his back now, flatly denying the town that crouched against its dirty haunch. 3 men hustled around the corner with large betrayer grins on their faces. They saw him seeing them, and the grins curdled in the second before he mowed them down. A woman had followed them, howling. She was large and fat, and known to the patrons of Sheb's as Aunt Mill. The gunslinger blew her backwards, and she landed in a whorish sprawl, her skirt rucked up between her thighs. He went down the steps and walked backwards into the desert, 10 paces, 20. The back door of the barber shop flew open, and they boiled out. He caught a glimpse of Sylvia Pittston. He opened up. They fell in squats. They fell backwards. They tumbled over the railing into the dust. They cast no shadows in the deathless purple light of the day. He realized he was screaming. He had been screaming all along. His eyes felt like cracked ball bearings. His balls had drawn up against his belly. His legs were wood. His ears were iron. The guns were empty, and they boiled at him, transmogrified into an eye and a hand, and he stood, screaming and reloading, his mind far away and absent, letting his hands do their reloading trick. Could he hold up a hand, tell them he had spent 1,000 years learning this trick and others, tell them of the guns and the blood that had blessed them? Not with his mouth, but his hands could speak their own tale. They were in throwing range as he finished reloading, and a stick struck him on the forehead and brought blood in abraded drops. In 2 seconds they would be in gripping distance. In the forefront he saw Kennerly. Kennerly's younger daughter, perhaps 11, Subi, 2 male barflies, a whore named Amy Felden. He let them all have it, and the ones behind them. Their bodies thumped like scarecrows. Blood and brains flew in streamers. They halted for a moment, startled,
the mob face shivering into individual, bewildered faces. A man ran in a large, screaming circle. A woman with blisters on her hands turned her head up and cackled feverishly at the sky. The man whom he had first seen sitting gravely on the steps of the mercantile store made a sudden and amazing load in his pants. He had time to reload one gun. Then it was Sylvia Pittston, running at him, waving a wooden cross in each hand. "Devil! Devil! Devil! Child killer! Monster! Destroy him, brothers and sisters! Destroy the child-killing interloper!" He put a shot into each of the cross pieces, blowing the roods to splinters, and 4 more into the woman's head. She seemed to accordion into herself and waver like a shimmer of heat. They all stared at her for a moment in tableau, while the gunslinger's fingers did their reloading trick. The tips of his fingers sizzled and burned. Neat circles were branded into the tips of each one. There were fewer of them now. He had run through them like a mower's scythe. He thought they would break with the woman dead, but someone threw a knife. The hilt struck him squarely between the eyes and knocked him over. They ran at him in a reaching, vicious clot. He fired his guns empty again, lying in his own spent shells. His head hurt, and he saw large brown circles in front of his eyes. He missed with one shot, downed 11 with the rest. But they were on him, the ones that were left. He fired the 4 shells he had reloaded, and then they were beating him, stabbing him. He threw a pair of them off his left arm and rolled away. His hands began doing their infallible trick. He was stabbed in the shoulder. He was stabbed in the back. He was hit across the ribs. He was stabbed in the ass with what might have been a meat fork. A small boy squirmed at him and made the only deep cut across the bulge of his calf. The gunslinger blew his head off. They were scattering, and he let them have it again, back shooting now. The ones left began to retreat toward the sand-colored, pitted buildings, and still the hands did their business, like over-eager dogs that want to do their rolling-over trick for you, not once or twice, but all night, and the hands were cutting them down as they ran. The last one made it as far as the steps of the barber shop's back porch, and then the gunslinger's bullet took him in the back of the head. "Yelp!" the man cried, and fell over. It was Tull's final word on the business. Silence came back in, filling jagged spaces. The gunslinger was bleeding from perhaps 20 different wounds, all of them shallow except for the cut across his calf. He bound it with a strip of shirt, and then straightened and examined his kill. They trailed in a twisting, zigzagging path from the back door of the barber shop to where he stood. They lay in all positions. None of them seemed to be sleeping. He followed the trail of death, counting as he went. In the general store, one man sprawled with his arms wrapped lovingly around the cracked candy jar he had dragged down with him. He ended up where he had started, in the middle of the deserted Main Street. He had shot and killed 39 men, 14 women, and 5 children. He had shot and killed everyone in Tull. A sickish sweet odor came to him on the first of the dry, stirring wind. He followed it, then looked up and nodded. The decaying body of Nort was spread-eagled atop the plank roof of Sheb's, crucified with wooden pegs. Mouth and eyes were open. The mark of a large and purple cloven hoof had been pressed into the skin of his grimy forehead. The gunslinger walked out of town. His mule was standing in a clump of weed about 40 yards further along the remnant of the coach road. The gunslinger led it back to Kennerly's stable. Outside, the wind was playing a jag-time tune. He put the mule up for the time being and went back to the tonk. He found a ladder in the back shed, went up to the roof, and cut Nort loose. The body was lighter than a bag of sticks. He tumbled it down to join the common people, those who would only have to die once. Then he went back inside, ate hamburgers, and drank 3 beers while the light failed and the sand began to fly. That night he slept in the bed where he and Allie had lain. He had no dreams. The next morning the wind was gone, and the sun was its usual bright and forgetful self. The bodies had gone south like tumbleweeds with the wind. At mid-morning, after he had bound all his cuts, he moved on as well. 18. He thought Brown had fallen asleep. The fire was down to no more than a spark, and the bird Zoltan had put his head under his wing. Just as he was about to get up and spread a pallet in the corner, Brown said, "There! You've told it. Do you feel better?" The gunslinger started. "Why would I feel bad?" "You're human, you said. No demon. Or did you lie?" "I didn't lie." He felt the grudging admittance in him. He liked Brown, honestly did, and he hadn't lied to the dweller in any way. "Who are you, Brown? Really, I mean." "Just me," he said, unperturbed. "Why do you have to think you're in the middle of such a mystery?" The gunslinger lit a smoke without replying. "I think you're very close to your man in black," Brown said. "Is he desperate?" "I don't know." "Are you?" "Not yet," the gunslinger said. He looked at Brown with a shade of defiance. "I go where I have to go. Do what I have to do." "That's good, then," Brown said, and turned over and went to sleep. 19. The next morning, Brown fed him and sent him on his way. In the daylight he was an amazing figure with his scrawny, sunburnt chest, pencil-like collarbones, and loony shock of red hair, the bird perched on his shoulder. "The mule?" the gunslinger asked. "I'll eat it," Brown said. "Okay." Brown offered his hand, and the gunslinger shook it. The dweller nodded to the southeast. "Walk easy. Long days and pleasant nights." "May you have twice the number." They nodded at each other, and then the man Allie had called Roland walked away, his body festooned with guns and water. He looked back once. Brown was rooting furiously at his little corn bed. The crow was perched on the low roof of his dwelling, like a gargoyle. 20. The fire was down, and the stars had begun to pale off. The wind walked restlessly, told its tale to no one. The gunslinger twitched in his sleep and was still again. He dreamed a thirsty dream. In the darkness, the shape of the mountains was invisible. Any thoughts of guilt, any feelings of regret had faded. The desert had baked them out. He found himself thinking more and more about Court, who had taught him to shoot. Court had known black from white. He stirred again and woke. He blinked at the dead fire with its own shape superimposed over the other, more geometrical one. He was a romantic. He knew it, and he guarded the knowledge jealously. It was a secret he had shared with only a few over the years. The girl named Susan, the girl from Megis, had been one of them. That, of course, made him think of Court again. Court was dead. They were all dead, except for him. The world had moved on. The gunslinger shouldered his gunner and moved on with it. Chapter 2. The Way Station. 1. A nursery rhyme had been playing itself through his mind all day, the maddening kind of thing that will not let go, that mockingly ignores all commands of the conscious mind to cease and desist. The rhyme was, "The rain in Spain falls on the plain. There is joy and also pain, but the rain in Spain falls on the plain. Time's a sheet, life's a stain. All the things we know will change, and all those things remain the same. But be ye mad or only sane, the rain in Spain falls on the plain. We walk in love, but fly in chains, and the plains in Spain fall in the rain." He didn't know what a plain was in the context of the rhyme's last couplet, but knew why the rhyme had occurred to him in the first place. There had been the recurring dream of his room in the castle, and of his mother who had sung it to him as he lay solemnly in the tiny bed by the window of many colors. She did not sing it at bedtimes, because all small boys born to the high speech must face the dark alone. But she sang to him at nap times, and he could remember the heavy gray rain light that shivered into rainbows on the counterpane. He could feel the coolness of the room and the heavy warmth of blankets, love for his mother and her red lips, the haunting melody of the little nonsense lyric, and her voice. Now it came back maddeningly, like a dog chasing its own tail in his mind as he walked. All his water was gone, and he knew he was very likely a dead man. He had never expected it to come to this, and he was sorry. Since noon he had been watching his feet rather than the way ahead. Out here, even the devil grass had grown stunted and yellow. The hardpan had disintegrated in places to mere rubble. The mountains were not noticeably clear, although 16 days had passed since he had left the hut of the last homesteader, a loony, sane young man on the edge of the desert. He had had a bird, the gunslinger remembered, but he couldn't remember the bird's name. He watched his feet move up and down like the heddles of a loom, listened to the nonsense rhyme sing itself into a pitiful garble in his mind, and wondered when he would fall down for the first time. He didn't want to fall. Even though there was no one to see him, it was a matter of pride. A gunslinger knows pride, that invisible bone that keeps the neck stiff. What hadn't come to him from his father had been kicked into him by Court, a boy's gentleman if there ever was one. Court, with his red bulb of a nose and his scarred face. He stopped and looked up suddenly. It made his head buzz, and for a moment his whole body seemed to float. The mountains dreamed against the far horizon, but there was something else up ahead, something much closer, perhaps only 5 miles away. He squinted at it, but his eyes were sandblasted and going glare-blind. He shook his head and began to walk again. The rhyme circled and buzzed. About an hour later he fell down and skinned his hands. He looked at the tiny beads of blood on his flaked skin with disbelief. The blood looked no thinner. It looked like any blood, now dying in the air. It seemed almost as smug as the desert. He dashed the drops away, hating them blindly. Smug? Why not? The blood was not thirsty. The blood was being served. The blood was being made sacrifice unto. Blood sacrifice. All the blood needed to do was run, and run, and run. He looked at the splotches that had landed on the hardpan and watched as they were sucked up with uncanny suddenness. How do you like that, blood? How does that suit you? Oh, Jesus, I'm far gone. He got up, holding his hands to his chest, and the thing he'd seen earlier was almost in front of him, so close it made him cry out, a dust-choked crow croak. It was a building. No, 2 buildings, surrounded by a fallen rail fence. The wood seemed old, fragile to the point of elvishness. It was wood being transmogrified into sand. One of the buildings had been a stable. The shape was clear and unmistakable. The other was a house, or an inn, a way station for the coach line. The tottering sand house, the wind had crusted the wood with grit until it looked like a sand castle that the sun had beat upon at low tide and hardened to a temporary abode, cast a thin line of shadow, and someone sat in the shadow, leaning against the building, and the building seemed to lean with the burden of his weight. Him, then. At last. The man in black. The gunslinger stood with his hands to his chest, unaware of his declamatory posture, and gawped. But instead of the tremendous winging excitement he had expected, or perhaps fear or awe, there was nothing but the dim atavistic guilt for the sudden raging hate of his own blood moments earlier, and the endless ring-a-rosy of the childhood song, The Rain in Spain. He moved forward, drawing one gun. Falls on the plain. He came the last quarter-mile at a jolting, flat-footed run, not trying to hide himself. There was nothing to hide behind. His short shadow raced him. He was not aware that his face had become a grey and dusty death mask of exhaustion. He was aware of nothing but the figure in the shadow. It did not occur to him until later that the figure might even have been dead. He kicked through one of the leaning fence rails. It broke in two without a sound, almost apologetically, and lunged across the dazzled and silent stable yard, bringing the gun up. "You're covered! You're covered! Hands up, you whoreson! You're—" The figure moved restlessly and stood up. The gunslinger thought, "My God, he is worn away to nothing. What's happened to him?" Because the man in black had shrunk 2 full feet, and his hair had gone white. He paused, struck dumb, his head buzzing tunelessly. His heart was racing at a lunatic rate, and he thought, "I'm dying right here." He sucked the white-hot air into his lungs and hung his head for a moment. When he raised it again, he saw it wasn't the man in black, but a boy with sun-bleached hair, regarding him with eyes that did not even seem interested. The gunslinger stared at him blankly and then shook his head in negation. But the boy survived his refusal to believe. He was a strong delusion, one wearing blue jeans with a patch on one knee and a plain brown shirt of rough weave. The gunslinger shook his head again and started for the stable with his head lowered, gun still in hand. He couldn't think yet. His head was filled with motes, and there was a huge, thrumming ache building in it. The inside of the stable was silent and dark and exploding with heat. The gunslinger stared around himself with huge, floating wall-eyes. He made a drunken about-face and saw the boy standing in the ruined doorway, staring at him. A blade of pain slipped smoothly into his head, cutting from temple to temple, dividing his brain like an orange. He reholstered his gun, swayed, put out his hands as if to ward off phantoms, and fell over on his face. Two. When he woke up, he was on his back, and there was a pile of light, odorless hay beneath his head. The boy had not been able to move him, but he had made him reasonably comfortable, and he was cool. He looked down at himself and saw that his shirt was dark and wet. He looked at his face and tasted water. He blinked at it. His tongue seemed to swell in his mouth. The boy was hunkered down beside him. When he saw the gunslinger's eyes were open, he reached behind him and gave the gunslinger a dented tin can filled with water. He grasped it with trembling hands and allowed himself to drink a little, just a little. When that was down and sitting in his belly, he drank a little more. Then he spilled the rest over his face and made shocked, blowing noises. The boy's pretty lips curved in a solemn little smile. "Would you want something to eat, sir?" "Not yet," the gunslinger said. There was still a sick ache in his head from the sunstroke, and the water sat uneasily in his stomach as if it did not know where to go. "Who are you?" "My name is John Chambers. You can call me Jake. I have a friend, well, sort of a friend. She works for us, who calls me Bama sometimes, but you can call me Jake." The gunslinger sat up, and the sick ache became hard and immediate. He leaned forward and lost a brief struggle with his stomach. "There's more," Jake said. He took the can and walked toward the rear of the stable. He paused and smiled back at the gunslinger uncertainly. The gunslinger nodded at him and then put his head down and propped it with his hands. The boy was well made, handsome, perhaps 10 or 11. There had been a shadow of fear on his face, but that was all right. The gunslinger would have trusted him far less if the boy hadn't shown fear. A strange, thumping hum began at the rear of the stable. The gunslinger raised his head alertly, hands going to the butts of his guns. The sound lasted for perhaps 15 seconds and then quit. The boy came back with the can, filled now. The gunslinger drank sparingly again, and this time it was a little better. The ache in his head was fading.
"I didn't know what to do with you when you fell down," Jake said. "For a couple of seconds there I thought you were going to shoot me."
"Maybe I was. I thought you were somebody else."
"The priest?"
The gunslinger looked up sharply. The boy studied him, frowning.
"He camped in the yard. I was in the house over there. Or maybe it was a depot. I didn't like him, so I didn't come out. He came in the night and went on the next day. I would have hidden from you, but I was sleeping when you came." He looked darkly over the gunslinger's head. "I don't like people. They fuck me up."
"What did he look like?"
The boy shrugged. "Like a priest. He was wearing black things."
"A hood and a cassock?"
"What's a cassock?"
"A robe, like a dress."
The boy nodded. "That's about right."
The gunslinger leaned forward, and something in his face made the boy recoil a little. "How long ago? Tell me, for your father's sake."
I...
Patiently, the gunslinger said, "I'm not going to hurt you."
"I don't know. I can't remember time. Every day's the same."
For the first time, the gunslinger wondered consciously how the boy had come to this place, with dry and man-killing leagues of desert all around it. But he would not make it his concern, not yet, at least. "Make your best guess. Long ago?"
"No, not long. I haven't been here long."
The fire lit in him again. He snatched up the can and drank from it with hands that trembled the smallest bit. A fragment of the cradle song recurred, but this time, instead of his mother's face, he saw the scarred face of Alice, who had been his Jilly in the now-defunct town of Tull. "A week? 2? 3? The boy looked at him distractedly.
"Yes."
"Which?"
"A week or 2.
He looked aside, blushing a little.
3 poops ago. That's the only way I can measure things now." He didn't even drink. I thought he might be the ghost of a priest, like in this movie I saw once, only Zorro figured out he wasn't a priest at all, or a ghost either. He was just a banker who wanted some land because there was gold on it. Mrs. Shaw took me to see that movie. It was in Times Square.
None of this made any sense to the gunslinger, so he did not comment on it.
"I was scared," the boy said. "I've been scared almost all the time." His face quivered like crystal on the edge of the ultimate destructive high note. He didn't even build a fire. He just sat there. I don't even know if he went to sleep.
Close. Closer than he had ever been, by the gods. In spite of his extreme dehydration, his hands felt faintly moist, greasy.
"There's some dried meat,"
the boy said. "All right." The gunslinger nodded. "Good." The boy got up to fetch it, his knees popping slightly. He made a fine, straight figure. The desert had not yet sapped him. His arms were thin, but the skin, although tanned, had not dried and cracked. "He's got juice," the gunslinger thought. "Mayhap some sand in his craw as well, or he would have taken one of my guns and shot me right where I lay." Or perhaps the boy simply hadn't thought of it. The gunslinger drank from the can again. Sand in his craw or not, he didn't come from this place. Jake came back with a pile of dried jerky on what looked like a sun-scoured breadboard. The meat was tough, stringy, and salty enough to make the cankered lining of the gunslinger's mouth sing. He ate and drank until he felt logy, and then settled back. The boy ate only a little, picking at the dark strands with an odd delicacy. The gunslinger regarded him, and the boy looked back at him candidly enough. "Where did you come from, Jake?" he asked finally.
"I don't know."
The boy frowned.
"I did know. I knew when I came here, but it's all fuzzy now, like a bad dream when you wake up. I have lots of bad dreams. Mrs. Shaw used to say it was because I watched too many horror movies on Channel 11.
"What's a channel?" A wild idea occurred to him. "Is it like a beam?"
"No, it's TV."
"What's TV?"
The boy touched his forehead. "Pictures."
"Did somebody tote you here, this Mrs. Shaw?"
"No," the boy said. I just was here.
Who is Mrs. Shaw?
I don't know.
Why did she call you Bama?
I don't remember.
You're not making any sense, the gunslinger said flatly. Quite suddenly, the boy was on the verge of tears.
I can't help it. I was just here. If you asked me about TV and channels yesterday, I bet I still could have remembered. Tomorrow, I probably won't even remember I'm Jake. Not unless you tell me, and you won't be here, will you? You're going to go away and I'll starve because you ate up almost all my food. I didn't ask to be here. I don't like it. It's spooky.
Don't feel so sorry for yourself. Make do.
I didn't ask to be here,
the boy repeated with bewildered defiance. The gunslinger ate another piece of the meat. Chewing the salt out of it before swallowing, the boy had become part of it, and the gunslinger was convinced he'd told the truth. He had not asked for it. It was too bad. He himself, he had asked for it. But he had not asked for the game to become this dirty. He had not asked to turn his guns on the townsfolk of Tull. Had not asked to shoot Allie with her sadly pretty face at the end marked by the secret she had finally asked to be let in on, using that word, that 19, like a key in a lock. Had not asked to be faced with a choice between duty and flat-out murder. It was not fair to ring in innocent bystanders and make them speak lines they didn't understand on a strange stage. Allie, he thought, Allie was at least part of this world in her own self-illusory way. But this boy, this goddamned boy. Tell me what you can remember, he told Jake.
It's only a little. It doesn't seem to make any sense anymore.
Tell me. Maybe I can pick up the sense. The boy thought about how to begin. He thought about it very hard.
There was a place, the one before this one, a high place with lots of rooms and a patio where you could look at tall buildings and water. There was a statue that stood in the water.
A statue in the water?
Yes. A lady with a crown and a torch and, I think, a book.
Are you making this up?
I guess I must be, the boy said hopelessly. There were things to ride in on the streets, big ones and little ones. The big ones were blue and white, the little ones were yellow, a lot of yellow ones. I walked to school. There were cement paths beside the streets, windows to look in, and more statues wearing clothes. The statues sold the clothes. I know it sounds crazy, but the statues sold the clothes.
The gunslinger shook his head and looked for a lie on the boy's face. He saw none.
I walked to school, the boy repeated doggedly, and I had a...
His eyes tilted, closed, and his lips moved gropingly.
A brown book bag. I carried a lunch, and I wore...
The groping again, agonized groping.
A tie.
A cravat?
I don't know.
The boy's fingers made a slow, unconscious clinching motion at his throat, one the gunslinger associated with hanging.
I don't know. It's just all gone.
And he looked away. May I put you to sleep? The gunslinger asked.
I'm not sleepy.
I can make you sleepy. And I can make you remember. Doubtfully, Jake asked,
How could you do that?
With this. The gunslinger removed one of the shells from his gun belt and twirled it in his fingers. The movement was dexterous, as flowing as oil. The shell cartwheeled effortlessly from thumb and index to index and second to second and ring to ring and pinky. It popped out of sight and reappeared, seemed to float briefly, then reversed. The shell walked across the gunslinger's fingers. The fingers themselves marched as his feet had marched on his last miles to this place. The boy watched, his initial doubt first replaced with plain delight, then by raptness, then by dawning blankness, as he opened. His eyes slipped shut. The shell danced back and forth. Jake's eyes opened again, caught the steady, limpid movement between the gunslinger's fingers a little while longer, and then they closed once more. The gunslinger continued the Howken, but Jake's eyes did not open again. The boy breathed with slow and steady calmness. Did this have to be part of it? Yes, it did. There was a certain cold beauty to it, like the lacy frettings that fringe hard blue ice packs. He once more seemed to hear his mother singing, not the nonsense about the rain in Spain this time, but sweeter nonsense coming from a great distance as he rocked on the rim of sleep. "Baby Bunting, baby dear, baby, bring your basket here." Not for the first time the gunslinger tasted the smooth, loaden taste of soul-sickness. The shell in his fingers, manipulated with such unknown grace, was suddenly horrific, the spoor of a monster. He dropped it into his palm, made a fist, and squeezed it with painful force. Had it exploded, in that moment he would have rejoiced at the destruction of his talented hand, for its only true talent was murder. There had always been murder in the world, but telling himself so was no comfort. There was murder, there was rape. There were unspeakable practices, and all of them were for the good, the bloody good, the bloody myth, for the Grail, for the Tower. Ah, the Tower stood somewhere in the middle of things, so they did say, rearing its black-grey bulk to the sky, and in his desert-scoured ears the gunslinger heard the faint, sweet sound of his mother's voice. "Chuzzit, chizzit, chazzit, bring enough to fill your basket." He brushed the song and the sweetness of the song aside. "Where are you?" he asked. 3.